Mid-February 1943, Sidi Bou Zid, Tunisia, the Sherman tank designated War Daddy II rolled to a stop in the desert sand, its white American star still visible beneath the hastily painted German cross. German reconnaissance troops from the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion had captured this M4A1 intact during the chaotic American retreat, and now they prepared it for an extraordinary journey across North Africa. The tank bore serial number USA 3067641, built by Lima Locomotive Works, belonging to Company G of the 1st Armoured Regiment. What made this captured vehicle remarkable wasn't its combat record or technical specifications. It was what this tank represented, a glimpse into American industrial capability that would soon be shipped to Germany for exhaustive analysis at the Kummersdorf proving grounds. Over the next 4.5 days, German personnel drove War Daddy II 350 kilometers across of hostile territory to the port of Sfax. Every kilometer of that journey revealed something German engineers had not anticipated. The engine never overheated despite the punishing North African heat. The transmission shifted smoothly through all 5 forward gears without complaint. The final drives maintained consistent performance across terrain that regularly disabled German tanks after far shorter movements. At Sfax, War Daddy II was loaded onto a cargo ship bound for Germany. The Army Weapons Office had issued explicit orders. This tank must reach Kummersdorf intact and operational. German intelligence had received reports about American tank production capabilities, but seeing a physical example made those statistics real in ways numbers on paper never could. As the ship steamed northward across the Mediterranean, Wehrmacht engineers prepared testing protocols that would measure, analyze, and document every aspect of American tank design. What those engineers could not know was that this captured Sherman represented only the beginning of American tank evolution. War Daddy II carried ammunition stored in vulnerable sponsons above the tracks, a design feature that would soon be recognized as the Sherman's most dangerous flaw. By the time this tank arrived at Kummersdorf in spring 1943, American engineers were already developing a solution that would fundamentally transform Sherman survivability, a modification the Germans would never capture, never test, and perhaps never fully understand. The mathematics of tank warfare had always been brutal. Armor thickness, gun penetration, crew training, tactical doctrine, all these factors determined survival on the battlefield. But one statistic haunted every tank crew in every army: the fire. When a tank was penetrated by enemy fire, what were the chances the vehicle would erupt in flames, trapping its crew inside a steel coffin? For early Sherman tanks fighting in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, that statistic was devastating. British and American reports documented fire rates between 60% and 80% for penetrated Shermans. 4 out of every 5 tanks that took a penetrating hit burst into flames. Crews who survived the initial penetration faced a desperate race against time. Could they escape through hatches before ammunition ignited? Could they evacuate wounded crewmates before the interior became an inferno? German tankers watched these Sherman fires with grim satisfaction. They allegedly nicknamed the American tank Tommy Cooker, after the British soldiers called Tommies, who crewed many of these vehicles. Some sources claim German troops also used the term Ronson, though this nickname's authenticity remains disputed. What wasn't disputed was the observable reality on the battlefield. Shermans burned with horrifying frequency when hit. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. American and British tank crews understood the danger intimately. They could see the design flaw every time they loaded ammunition into their tanks. 75mm shells, each containing over 2 kilograms of propellant powder, stored in vertical racks along the hull's sponsons, directly above the tracks. These ammunition stowage bins sat in the most vulnerable part of the tank, exposed to side penetrations that were far more common than frontal hits. The propellant powder in each shell was designed to burn rapidly and completely, generating the gas pressure needed to propel the projectile at high velocity. That same characteristic made it extraordinarily dangerous when enemy fire penetrated the thin sponson armor. A single spark from a penetrating shell could ignite one round, that round's propellant would flash, igniting adjacent rounds. Within seconds, the entire ammunition load would cook off in a cascading inferno that gave crews almost no time to escape. British forces, receiving thousands of Shermans through Lend-Lease, were the first to document this vulnerability systematically. British Operational Research Section No. 2 conducted detailed analysis of knocked-out tanks in North Africa and Italy. Their findings, compiled from examining 40 Sherman tanks, revealed the stark mathematics of survival. 33 tanks burned after being penetrated. 7 did not. An 82% fire rate following an average of just 1.89 penetrations per tank. The British shared these findings with American authorities in 1943. The reports triggered immediate concern among U.S. Army Ordnance Department engineers. If the British numbers were accurate, and field commanders confirmed they were, then the Sherman had a fundamental design flaw that cost American lives with every engagement. American engineers began systematic investigation into why Shermans burned so frequently. They conducted and controlled tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, varying the conditions to isolate causative factors. First, they tested Shermans with ammunition removed but fuel and oil present. Penetrations rarely caused fires. The gasoline fuel, despite common assumptions, was not the primary culprit. Then, they reversed the test. Shermans fully loaded with ammunition but with all fuel and oil drained. The results were even more alarming than British field reports suggested. 90% of penetrations to the fighting compartment caused immediate fires. 9 out of 10 hits ignited the ammunition. The propellant stowage wasn't just vulnerable, it was catastrophically dangerous under any combat condition. Engineers tested carbon dioxide fire extinguishers, standard equipment in all Shermans. The extinguishers proved almost useless against propellant fires. The ammunition burned too hot and too fast for CO2 suppression to work effectively. Only massive quantities of water could fight propellant fires, and water wasn't available inside a buttoned-up tank under combat conditions. The problem was clear. The solution was not. American tank production in 1943 was reaching unprecedented levels. Multiple factories across the United States were producing Shermans at a combined rate exceeding 1,000 tanks per month. Fisher Tank Arsenal, Detroit Tank Arsenal, Baldwin Locomotive Works, American Locomotive Company, Pacific Car and Foundry. Chrysler, Ford, all these manufacturers were running assembly lines at maximum capacity to meet military demand. Any design change that required major modifications would slow production for months. Retooling assembly lines, retraining workers, redesigning component specifications, all these changes carried enormous time costs. And time, in early 1943, was something the Allies could not afford to waste. The invasion of Sicily was scheduled for July. Italy would follow. Eventually, the invasion of France would require every Sherman the factories could produce. Engineers needed a solution that could be implemented quickly, didn't require complete vehicle redesign, and actually worked to prevent ammunition fires. The first attempt was a field expedient measure. Beginning in 1943, armoured units in North Africa and Italy began welding 1-inch thick appliqué armour plates to the sponson sides, directly over the ammunition stowage bins. The added armour might prevent or slow enemy penetrations, giving ammunition some additional protection. Field reports on appliqué armour effectiveness were mixed. The armour added weight and complexity to manufacturing without fundamentally addressing the problem. A penetration that defeated the appliqué armour still struck ammunition stored in vulnerable positions. The added protection was marginal at best, and many engineers doubted it provided any real benefit beyond psychological reassurance for crews. Meanwhile, at Aberdeen Proving Ground and other testing facilities, engineers experimented with more radical solutions. They tested placing ammunition racks below the turret basket, beneath the level of the tracks, where side penetrations were less likely to strike them directly. This seemed promising, but required significant internal modifications that would disrupt production. Then someone proposed surrounding the ammunition bins with water. The concept was simple but potentially revolutionary. Water jackets around each ammunition cell would absorb heat from any penetrating fragments. If ammunition began to ignite, water would pour onto the flames, suppressing the fire before it could spread to other rounds. The initial test of this water jacket concept failed spectacularly. Engineers surrounded an ammunition rack with water and then fired a 75mm shell into it. The penetration created hydraulic shock that tore the entire rack apart. The water, under the sudden pressure of the penetration, acted like a shaped charge itself, destroying the rack more thoroughly than the shell alone might have. Engineers refined the design. Instead of a single water jacket surrounding multiple shells, they created concentric cells. Each ammunition round sat in its own cylindrical chamber. Water filled the space between the inner chamber wall and an outer protective wall. Crucially, they left some airspace at the top of each water jacket, preventing hydraulic shock from building destructive pressure. This improved design went into hull mock-ups for testing. Engineers fired 37mm and 75mm shells at ammunition stored in these new water-jacketed racks. Out of 14 ammunition cells punctured, only 2 caught fire. The reduction was dramatic. From a 90% fire rate to a 14% fire rate, the water jackets worked. But the wet stowage system, as it came to be called, required more than just water jackets. Engineers completely redesigned ammunition placement inside the Sherman's hull. Instead of storing shells in sponson racks above the tracks, all main gun ammunition would be moved to the hull floor, below the turret ring. This placement put ammunition beneath the track line, significantly reducing the vulnerable area exposed to side penetrations. The redesigned layout actually increased total ammunition capacity, despite initial fears it would reduce available stowage. New Shermans could carry up to 150 rounds, more than earlier models. However, the ready rack, ammunition immediately accessible to the loader without opening floor bins, was reduced to just 6 rounds. Loaders would need to replenish the ready rack more frequently during extended engagements, but the trade-off in survivability seemed more than worthwhile. The wet stowage bins used a water-glycerin mixture rather than pure water. Glycerin lowered the freezing point, preventing the solution from freezing in winter conditions. The mixture filled the space between concentric cylinders surrounding each shell. When penetrated, the liquid would flow out over any fragments or hot metal, cooling them before they could ignite propellant powder. By late 1943, the wet stowage design was finalized. Production implementation began in January 1944. Different Sherman variants received wet stowage at different times, as each manufacturer retooled its assembly lines. The M4A1, with the 76mm gun, received wet stowage first, in January. The M4A3 with the 75mm gun followed in February. Additional variants came online through spring and summer 1944. Tanks equipped with wet stowage ammunition racks received a W designation after their model number. An M4A 375W meant a Ford-engine Sherman with a 75mm gun and wet ammunition storage. That single letter represented the difference between an 80% chance of burning when penetrated and a 10 to 15% chance. The wet stowage modification added 900 pounds to the Sherman's weight. The water and glycerin mixture, the reinforced floor bins, the redesigned internal layout, all this added mass without adding armor or firepower. From a purely technical perspective, the added weight reduced the Sherman's already modest power-to-weight ratio. The tank became slightly slower, slightly less maneuverable, but American engineers understood that specifications on paper meant nothing if crews died in burning tanks. The 900 pounds of wet stowage equipment would save far more American lives than 900 pounds of additional armor plating ever could. This was applied engineering at its finest, not optimizing for impressive specifications, but solving the actual problem that killed crews in combat. The modification also required crew training updates. Loaders needed to understand the new ammunition storage layout. They needed to know which bins held which ammunition types. They needed to practice replenishing the ready rack quickly during lulls in combat. Commanders needed to understand that wet stowage wasn't perfect protection. It dramatically reduced fire risk, but didn't eliminate it entirely. As wet stowage, Shermans began reaching frontline units in summer 1944. Crews noticed the difference immediately. Tanks that took penetrating hits increasingly survived without catastrophic fires. Wounded could be evacuated. Crews could sometimes fight their way out of ambushes rather than abandoning vehicles at the first hit. The psychological impact was as important as the physical protection. Crews who believed their tank might not burn fought with more confidence and determination. The U.S. Army conducted formal studies comparing dry stowage and wet stowage Sherman fire rates after sufficient combat data accumulated. The 1945 study confirmed what field observations suggested. Dry stowage Shermans, the early production models, burned 60 to 80% of the time when penetrated. Wet stowage Shermans burned 10 to 15% of the time. The improvement was so dramatic it almost defied belief. From 60 to 80% down to 10 to 15%. That reduction meant 4 to 7 times fewer catastrophic fires. It meant crews who took penetrating hits had reasonable chances of survival. It meant tanks that could be recovered and repaired rather than abandoned as burned-out hulks. It meant American tank battalions could sustain operations without constant crew replacements. British forces, receiving wet stowage Shermans through 1944 and 1945, confirmed similar results. Canadian units reported the same dramatic improvement. Even Soviet forces, operating the diesel M4A2 variant with wet stowage, noted the enhanced survivability. The modification worked across all theatres, all variants, all combat conditions. Back in Germany, Wehrmacht engineers at Kummersdorf continued testing War Daddy 2 and other captured Shermans throughout 1943 and into 1944. They measured automotive reliability that exceeded German tank standards. They documented the synchronized transmission that made the Sherman easier to drive than any German tank. They analyzed the Continental radial engine's remarkable tolerance for varied operating conditions. They examined the final drives that rarely failed even under sustained combat stress. What those German engineers never captured was a wet stowage Sherman. Every Sherman tested at Kummersdorf, every Sherman pressed into German service after capture, every Sherman examined by Wehrmacht intelligence, all were early production models with dry ammunition stowage. The Germans never saw the water-jacketed bins. They never tested the redesigned floor stowage. They never measured the difference between 60 to 80% fire rates and 10 to 15% fire rates. This wasn't because wet stowage Shermans were rare or restricted to rear areas. By late 1944, wet stowage variants constituted the majority of new Shermans reaching combat units. The M4A375W became the standard American medium tank in Europe. The M4A376W equipped armoured divisions throughout the Ardennes campaign. The M4A3E2 jumbo assault tank, introduced in June 1944, had wet stowage as standard equipment. The Germans simply never captured one intact enough for detailed technical analysis. Wet stowage Shermans that were knocked out and abandoned typically burned from other causes: combat damage, fuel fires, external fires, destroying the evidence of internal modifications. Shermans captured intact were usually abandoned due to mechanical issues or crew panic, situations that occurred less frequently as American crew quality improved through 1944. German intelligence reports from the Western and Italian fronts documented Sherman casualties throughout 1944 and 45. Wehrmacht officers noted that American tanks continued to burn when hit, but they never distinguished between early dry stowage models and later wet stowage variants. To German observers, all Shermans looked essentially identical from the outside. The external appearance revealed nothing about the revolutionary changes happening inside American tanks. German propaganda continued to emphasize Sherman vulnerability throughout the war. Articles in military publications and newspapers described the American tank as inferior to German designs, easy prey for German guns, prone to catastrophic fires. These assessments, accurate when applied to early Shermans, became increasingly outdated as wet stowage models dominated American armored formations. The 10th SS Panzer Division captured 12 M4A1 Shermans at Hagenau in January 1945 during Operation Nordwind. These tanks, originally belonging to the American 43rd Tank Battalion, were abandoned intact when their crews retreated during the German assault. The Germans formed these captured Shermans into the 13th Company of the 10th SS Panzer Regiment and used them in combat operations through the final months of the war. These 12 Shermans served as reconnaissance vehicles and mobile reserves, roles requiring sustained movement and mechanical reliability. German commanders praised the tank's automotive excellence in after-action reports. The Shermans reached objectives without mechanical failures. They maneuvered across terrain that immobilized German Panthers. They provided fire support with consistent reliability that German crews had learned never to expect from their own vehicles. What those SS tankers didn't realize, or perhaps never documented, was whether these captured Shermans had wet stowage. If they did, and the later production date suggests they probably did, then German crews were operating the most survivable Sherman variants ever produced, without understanding what made them different from earlier models. They were benefiting from American engineering innovation they couldn't see and didn't recognize. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The strategic implications of wet stowage extended far beyond individual crew survival. Tank losses in armoured warfare fell into several categories. Catastrophic losses, vehicles destroyed so thoroughly they could never be recovered or repaired. These included tanks that burned completely, leaving only charred hulls. Mobility kills, vehicles immobilized by track damage, engine failure, or transmission problems but potentially repairable. And firepower kills, vehicles whose weapons were damaged but could still move. Early Shermans, with dry stowage, that took penetrating hits fell overwhelmingly into the catastrophic loss category. The 60 to 80% fire rate meant most knocked-out Shermans burned beyond any hope of recovery. Even if the initial penetration caused relatively minor damage, the subsequent ammunition fire destroyed the vehicle completely. Burned-out Shermans couldn't be repaired or returned to service. Wet stowage fundamentally changed this equation. A Sherman with wet stowage that took a penetrating hit had an 85 to 90% chance of not catching fire. Many of these vehicles could be recovered, repaired, and returned to frontline service within days or weeks. The reduction in catastrophic losses meant American armored divisions could sustain their fighting strength despite heavy combat. The U.S. 3rd Armored Division's casualty statistics illustrated this difference. The division entered combat in Normandy with approximately 132 M4 Sherman tanks. During the entire European campaign from June 1944 to May 1945, the division had approximately 648 Shermans completely destroyed and another 700 knocked out, but subsequently repaired and returned to service. This 580% loss rate sounds catastrophic until you understand what it represents. The division could absorb such heavy losses only because many knocked-out Shermans survived to be repaired. If all 1,348 damaged Shermans had burned like early dry stowage models typically did, the division would have been destroyed multiple times over, with no possibility of recovery. American logistics units developed efficient procedures for recovering and repairing battle-damaged Shermans. Tank retrieval companies used M32 recovery vehicles, themselves based on Sherman chassis, to tow disabled tanks from battlefields. Mobile maintenance battalions established repair facilities just behind the front lines. Ordnance companies stockpiled replacement components, power packs, transmissions, guns, turrets, everything needed to rebuild damaged vehicles. This entire logistics system depended on damaged Shermans surviving in repairable condition. Wet stowage made that survival possible. A Sherman with a penetrated hull, damaged tracks, and a wounded crew could be recovered if it didn't burn. The same vehicle with dry stowage would likely have become a total loss, adding to the pile of charred hulls that littered every battlefield. German armoured divisions, by contrast, saw their strength decline steadily through 1944 and 1945 as losses exceeded replacement capacity. German Panthers and Tigers that broke down or took combat damage often had to be abandoned because recovery assets were insufficient and spare parts were unavailable. Even when German vehicles were recovered, repair took far longer than American Sherman repairs due to the complexity of German designs. The Panthers' notorious final drive failures meant many tanks were abandoned after travelling less than 150 kilometres. These vehicles weren't destroyed by enemy fire. They weren't even engaged in combat. They simply broke down, and German logistics couldn't recover or repair them in time. By comparison, wet stowage Shermans that survived combat actions could be repaired and returned to frontline service repeatedly. British forces examined captured German tanks throughout the Italian and Northwest European campaigns. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, British authorities conducted comprehensive assessments of German tank designs. They examined Panthers, Tigers, and other vehicles extensively. One conclusion appeared repeatedly in British technical reports. German tanks caught fire at rates comparable to or exceeding early Sherman fire rates. A British study found that from a sample of 22 Panthers examined in combat zones, 14 had burned after being penetrated. That's 63%, remarkably similar to early Sherman fire rates. From a sample of 5 Tigers examined, 4 had burned. 80%. The Panzer IV, Germany's most common tank, burned 4 out of 5 times in the British sample examined. 80%. These fire rates weren't unique to Shermans. They represented the brutal reality of tank warfare across all armies. Ammunition storage anywhere inside a tank created fire risk when the vehicle was penetrated. German tanks stored their ammunition throughout the fighting compartment, along hull sides, behind armour plates, in turret baskets. Every location was vulnerable to enemy fire. What made the Sherman unique wasn't that it burned more often than German tanks. Early Shermans burned at rates comparable to German vehicles. What made the Sherman unique was that American engineers identified the problem, developed a solution, implemented it across thousands of tanks, and reduced fire rates to a fraction of what any other army achieved. That was the revolution wet stowage represented. American pragmatism solving a problem other armies simply accepted as inevitable. German engineers never developed comparable solutions for their tanks. They never implemented water-jacketed ammunition storage. They never redesigned internal layouts to place ammunition below the track line. They never conducted the systematic testing that proved wet stowage worked. German tank development through 1944 and 45 focused on increasing gun power and armour thickness, while reliability and crew survivability received minimal attention. The French army, operating captured Panthers from 1946 to 1950, documented this oversight extensively in their technical reports. French tankers, accustomed to operating Shermans during the war, found Panthers unreliable, uncomfortable, and dangerous. French technical report Le Panther from 1947 noted numerous deficiencies but paid particular attention to crew survivability issues. French engineers noted that Panthers had no provisions for preventing ammunition fires. The ammunition storage was as vulnerable as early Sherman dry stowage had been. If anything, Panthers were more vulnerable because their ammunition was stored in even more exposed positions. French crews operating Panthers in training exercises experienced several ammunition fires that killed or injured personnel. These weren't combat situations. They were peacetime training accidents that demonstrated fundamental design flaws German engineers never addressed. The British post-war evaluation of Panthers reached similar conclusions. British authorities completed 9 Panthers in spring 1946 using German parts and technicians at a captured German factory. They intended to conduct standard acceptance trials on these vehicles. The trials had to be halted when all the Panthers broke down from mechanical failures. The report, dated February 1948, stated bluntly that very little information of any value was obtained due to the general mechanical unreliability of Panther and Jagdpanther tanks. Neither the French nor British reports mentioned wet stowage or any German equivalent, because no such system existed. German tanks entering service in 1946, built from wartime components, had the same vulnerability to ammunition fires that German tanks in 1943 had. There had been no evolution, no improvement, no solution. The problem that American engineers solved in late 1943 remained unsolved in German designs 2 to 3 years later. Soviet forces captured hundreds of Panthers on the Eastern Front. They pressed some into Soviet service after applying German markings and tactical numbers. Soviet tanker accounts describe using captured Panthers briefly before mechanical failures disabled them. None of the Soviet accounts mention any superior survivability compared to Soviet T-34 tanks or American Lend-Lease Shermans. The Panthers performed adequately when they ran, but they rarely ran for long. Dmitry Losa, hero of the Soviet Union and commander of Sherman-equipped units on the Eastern Front, wrote extensively about his experiences in his post-war memoir. Losa commanded M4A2 diesel Shermans, many of which had wet stowage. He praised Sherman reliability, crew comfort, and overall design philosophy. He never mentioned ammunition fires as a significant problem, which suggests the wet stowage variants he operated worked as advertised. Losa's account contrasts sharply with Soviet experiences operating T-34 tanks. Soviet crews reported high casualties from ammunition fires when T-34s were penetrated. Soviet tank doctrine emphasized aggressive offensive operations, accepting high casualties as necessary costs of victory. The difference between Sherman and T-34 survivability would have been apparent to any crew operating both types. Israeli forces, operating Shermans extensively from the 1940s through the 1970s, conducted their own modifications and upgrades. Israeli engineers replaced engines, upgraded guns, improved armor, modernized fire control systems. They turned World War II Shermans into effective 1960s-era tanks that fought successfully against Soviet-designed T-54s and T-62s. Israeli modifications retained the basic Sherman hull and internal layout, including the wet stowage ammunition placement. Israeli tankers fighting in the 1967 Six-Day War and 1973 Yom Kippur War reported survivability rates that exceeded expectations given the age of their vehicles. Part of that survivability came from Israeli upgrades. Part came from superior crew training, but part came from the fundamental soundness of the Sherman design, including features like wet stowage that American engineers had implemented 30 years earlier. Chilean forces purchased Israeli M4A1 Shermans, upgraded versions with 105mm guns, in the late 1970s. Chile operated these tanks until 1999, keeping some in reserve until 2006. That operational longevity, extending Sherman's service life more than 60 years beyond initial production, testified to design decisions made in 1942 through 1944. Wet stowage was one of those decisions. Not the most visible, not the most celebrated, not the modification that military historians emphasize when discussing tank development, but wet stowage represented applied engineering excellence that saved thousands of American, British, Canadian, and Soviet crew lives. It represented systematic problem-solving that identified a critical flaw, developed a practical solution, and implemented it across mass production. The Germans never captured this innovation. They never tested it. They never understood it. German intelligence reports from 1944 and 1945 continued describing Sherman vulnerability to ammunition fires based on observations of early production models. German tactical doctrine continued to assume Shermans would burn at high rates when penetrated. German tankers continued to fight, believing their technical superiority would compensate for numerical inferiority. That belief, that assumption, became increasingly detached from battlefield reality through late 1944 and early 1945. The Shermans German troops faced in France, Belgium and Germany weren't the same tanks they'd encountered in North Africa and Italy. These were M4A3 variants with wet stowage, improved suspension, better armour arrangements, and either 76mm guns or British 17-pounder guns in Firefly variants. These late-war Shermans still couldn't match Panther or Tiger frontal armour. They still couldn't penetrate German heavy tanks at long range without specialised ammunition, but they didn't burn 4 out of 5 times when hit. They survived to fight another engagement. Their crews lived to gain experience. Their maintenance requirements remained manageable. Their logistics demands stayed within American supply capabilities. The wet stowage modification, invisible from outside the tank, represented the type of advantage that determined campaigns rather than individual battles. One wet stowage Sherman might not defeat one Panther in direct combat, but a battalion of wet stowage Shermans could sustain operations that a battalion of Panthers simply could not match. The American tanks kept fighting while German tanks broke down, ran out of fuel, or couldn't be repaired after minor damage. By spring 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany from west and east, the disparity became impossible to ignore. American armoured divisions maintained combat effectiveness despite heavy losses because their Shermans could be recovered and repaired. German armoured divisions declined to combat ineffectiveness because their tanks, technically superior in many specifications, couldn't be sustained in field operations. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's elite armoured formations, entered the Battle of Normandy in June 1944 with 183 tanks and assault guns. By the end of July, after 6 weeks of combat, the division had fewer than 30 operational vehicles. Most losses weren't from combat. They were from mechanical breakdowns that couldn't be repaired, fuel shortages that immobilized vehicles, and ammunition shortages that rendered tanks useless. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division, fighting in the same campaign, entered Normandy with approximately 260 Sherman tanks. The division suffered heavy losses through the summer and fall of 1944, but maintained combat effectiveness by continuously recovering and repairing damaged vehicles. The division's organic maintenance units performed miracles of battlefield repair, returning knocked-out Shermans to service within days. That difference between German decline and American sustainability reflected dozens of design decisions, logistics innovations, and doctrine choices. Wet stowage was one decision among many, but it was a critical decision that saved lives and maintained fighting strength at moments when battles hung in the balance. The story of wet stowage demonstrates that winning wars requires more than impressive specifications. It requires identifying real problems, developing practical solutions, and implementing them quickly across mass production. It requires accepting that the best is often the enemy of the good enough. It requires understanding that crew confidence and survivability matter as much as gun penetration and armor thickness. American engineers understood these principles. German engineers, brilliant in many ways, often did not. German tank development pursued theoretical optimization at the expense of practical sustainability. American tank development pursued practical adequacy while continuously improving reliability and survivability. Two different philosophies, two different approaches, two very different results. War Daddy II, that first captured Sherman tested at Kummersdorf in spring 1943, told German engineers much about American automotive excellence. It revealed synchronized transmissions, herringbone gears, durable final drives, reliable engines. It demonstrated that Americans could build tanks as well as they built automobiles. It proved that mass production didn't require sacrificing quality. What War Daddy II couldn't tell German engineers was how American tanks would evolve over the next 2 years. It couldn't reveal the wet stowage system being tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground while German engineers measured armour thickness at Kummersdorf. It couldn't predict that American engineers would reduce ammunition fire rates from 80% to 15% through applied engineering innovation. That innovation, invisible and unknown to German intelligence, represented American industrial strength at its finest. Not building the best tank by any single metric, not achieving theoretical perfection, but solving the most critical problems quickly and effectively while maintaining mass production. Building tanks that worked, that survived, that could be repaired, that crews trusted. 79 years after the war's end, historians still debate tank specifications and combat records. They compare gun penetration tables and armor thickness measurements. They analyze tactical engagements and strategic campaigns. These debates miss the fundamental lesson that wet stowage teaches. Wars are won by systems that work under real conditions, by designs that solve actual problems rather than theoretical challenges, by innovations that save lives rather than specifications that look impressive on paper. The Sherman's wet stowage ammunition system embodied all these principles. It took a critical flaw and fixed it. It took an 80% fire rate and reduced it to 15%. It took a death trap and made it survivable. The Germans never knew. They never captured the evidence. They never tested the innovation. They continued fighting with assumptions about Sherman vulnerability that became obsolete as wet stowage models dominated Allied armoured formations. That gap between perception and reality, between what German intelligence believed and what American engineering achieved, was just one more advantage in a war decided by industrial capacity and systematic innovation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.